This video will contain spoilers for Jujutsu Kaisen chapters 80, 81, and 82, and Season 2, Episode 7, otherwise known as Episode 31. And we'll have hints from the manga about things to come. So, the second season of Jujutsu Kaisen is back, and in this series, I'm going to be analyzing the story of it as it airs, and as a manga reader, comparing the anime to the manga to see what they pulled over directly, what they modified or expanded, and what they just straight up removed. So let's begin with the 7th episode of Season 2 of Jujutsu Kaisen. First, I'll recap the plot and explain what chapters it covered. A quick heads up before we start. The action in this episode is fairly different from the manga, but it ends up pretty much the same. They just expanded the action scenes, which is pretty nice actually. You'll see this sometimes with anime where they take some liberties with the way the fights work out in terms of their specifics. But anyway, the recap for these episodes is based on the manga. What I wrote will be taken from the manga, so I'll include panels where things differ to make it clear what I'm talking about. We pick up right where we left off, with Mahito getting blasted by an ultra cannon outputting 1 year's worth of cursed energy all at once. He escapes the blast zone by morphing his feet into cute little bunny feet and jumping away. As he regenerates, he speculates that Mekamaru might be trying to run his cursed energy out by burning him, and declares that he'll drag Muda out of the cockpit. Muda realizes that Mahito will now be aware of the fact that Mekamaru's attacks can't touch his soul and therefore won't be enough to hurt him. He takes a few swings at him as Mahito bounds across the dam, and Mahito escapes by diving off the dam into the pond. As he's falling, he morphs into a fish and attempts to use the water to obscure his movements. Muda stores up a 2-year charge and hits the water at his feet with a miracle cannon. He succeeds in displacing a bunch of water, but the only damage to Mahito is the loss of his clothing. In the manga, it's hard to say whether his pants are just messed up, or if he lost those too and morphed his lower half to be furry, kind of like a Super Saiyan 4 had on their upper body, or maybe like a satyr, if you prefer classical mythology over being a weeb. Mahito pulls a Go-Go Gadget extendo arm like Piccolo and grabs hold of the cabling behind Mekamaru's head. That being said, Muda notes that Mahito is going all in on attacking and is ignoring his attacks now that he thinks they can't hurt him. He decides now is the time to reveal the card up his sleeve and injects a capsule into a slot in his cockpit. Mahito does the Mario Fist thing again and gives Mekamaru a big ol' smack to the noggin. Muda notes that if he's not careful, Mahito's strength could tear apart his armor. Having injected the capsule into the slot, he refers to it as a Jujutsu technique charge, and notes that he has 4 chances left as Mahito morphs his arms into wings, and looks kinda like the Rito from the last 2 Zelda games. Mekamaru makes a finger gun, and the tip of its finger opens to reveal a small cannon. It takes a second to lock onto the Birdman and fires. A small capsule, ribbed for his displeasure, lodges itself into Mahito's shoulder. It appears to do nothing at first, and Mahito gets all cocky about it, but then it explodes and takes off his arm. Taking advantage of Mahito's surprise, Mekamaru swats him like a fly, sending him flying into the trees on the edge of the pond. As Mahito tries to work out how a part of his soul was actually destroyed, Mekamaru presses the assault with some Jojo Ora punches. Mahito escapes again by turning even further into a bird, this time shifting his head into kind of like a beakish shape, placing the wings on his back, which keeps his hands free, and turns his feet into clawed talons. Muda notices that he seemingly regenerated the arm that was blown off, but realizes he just manipulated his soul to make it look like the arm regenerated. He takes the fact that he's trying to hide his wounds as a good sign, and presses the attack. Looking on from his seat in the spectator stands, Geto notices that Muda's plan of attack is working as well. He notes that while it's probably only temporary, Muda's cursed energy output is at the same level as a special grade sorcerer's. Pairing that with the effectiveness of his strategies, Geto thinks he might just win. Pooling 5 years of cursed energy, Muda attacks with Pigeon Viola, an attack that seems to make 5 balls of cursed energy that seek out their target, which is very reminiscent to the homing soul mass spell from Dark Souls. As Mahito dodges the spell, he strategizes that he first needs to figure out which of Mekamaru's attacks can hit his soul, when he's caught off guard again by a blind punch from Mekamaru. As he seems to have avoided it, another comes and directly strikes him, sending him flying into another tree. Muda, becoming confident in his victory, readies another Jujutsu technique charge, which takes the form of a big middle finger spike. Fun fact, the image we see here of Muda imagining his friends and how he's going to meet up with them was actually introduced in the anime way back in episode 16 during the Goodwill event, but in the manga, this is its first appearance. Anyway, unfortunately for Muda, he was unaware of the special binding vow that forfeits your victory as soon as you start prematurely celebrating. Mahito performs a domain expansion, and hits Muda with self-embodiment of perfection. Using the guaranteed hit of his domain, Mahito uses idle transfiguration on Muda from afar. Mekamaru falls over, and Mahito gloats. He figures that Muda assumed he wouldn't use it since Halloween is coming up and he'd want to save his curse energy for Shibuya. But he states that 10 days is more than enough time to recoup his losses, and chastises Muda for putting so many of his hopes and dreams into his strategy, claiming it makes things too awkward. Since he turned around, he doesn't realize at this point that Mekamaru has risen up again behind him. Mekamaru gives Mahito the finger right through his chest. Muda explains that he has 4 tubes, each of which has a technique sealed inside them, as it was the only way he could think of to make it work. He recaps that the first tube failed, the second tube was meant to help protect from Mahito's domain, and the third tube appears to have worked. In the Heian era, which was the height of Jujutsu, Sadatsuna Ashia created a domain technique to help protect his followers from curses and curse users. It was referred to as the domain for the weak, and was passed down through his family. Supposedly, it was forbidden to be taught to those outside the family, but regardless, Muda was able to replicate it because he had witnessed Miwa using it, her technique going by the modern name for the technique, New Shadow Style, Simple Domain. By injecting it into Mekamaru's fingers, he could use Simple Domain to neutralize Mahito's idle transfiguration and directly hurt him. Mahito appears to explode and the barrier around his domain collapses. Muta lets out a roar of triumph, thinking he's won. Geto reacts to the use of Simple Domain, explaining how it worked, and also explaining that using it allowed Muta to avoid Mahito's guaranteed hit from his domain expansion. Muta turns to Geto, looking to deal with him now as well, and is happy to have made the fortunate miscalculation that left him with 1 more Simple Domain tube and 9 years of cursed energy remaining. As he readies a blast at Geto, Mahito suddenly breaks through his cockpit, having taken on this terrifying multi-armed monstrosity look, which kinda reminds me of the Wiggler from Super Mario Sunshine for some reason. Why does everything about the things Mahito does remind me of Mario? Anyway, Muda prepares his final tube of Simple Domain, planning to hit Mahito directly with it. We cut away, and are treated to a heartbreaking scene of Miwa opening up to the now lifeless Mekamaru puppet, and talking about how happy it's made her to feel more connected to everyone, and how she'd like to get to know him better. As she promises to come see him someday, we cut back to a now dead Muda, and another lifeless Mekamaru. Geto asks Mahito if he didn't cut it a little close, but Mahito assures him it all went according to plan, revealing that he just faked exploding and released his domain on his own to catch Muda off guard. Mahito remarks upon getting to see Simple Domain, glad that he was able to experience it firsthand before Shibuya. Geto also states that they finished working out the terms for the veil they commissioned for Shibuya, so they'll be able to empower people with additional cursed energy and magic words. With that, the Day of Reckoning arrives. On Halloween night, a curtain is lowered around Shibuya. It allows sorcerers in and out freely, but traps civilians. It also blocks outgoing cell signals. A bunch of civilians at the Scramble Crossing are sucked into the underground train platforms underneath the Tokyo department store Toyoko branch, which, by the way, closed down in March of 2020, so that building doesn't exist anymore. And the Hikarie building. Ijichi explains to Nanami, Megumi, and Ino the situation, and Nanami asks about Gojo. We cut to Akari with Naobito, who is the head of the Zenin clan, Maki, and Nobara. Akari explains the sorcerers are meant to be on standby outside the curtain. Then we cut to Kusakabe, who briefly appeared in the background in the movie and had one line, and Panda. Kusakabe explains that the higher-ups decided to send in Gojo by himself, and the rest of the sorcerer teams were placed on standby outside the curtain to deal with anything or anyone that might make it past him. As civilians continue banging on the curtain trying to get out, Gojo arrives, and the episode ends. With the recap out of the way, let's go over the basic points of the plot. 1. The fight that started last episode continues. Mahito wins. Buddha Kokichi, dead. It is now time for Shibuya. 2. A curtain is lowered around Shibuya on Halloween, blocking outgoing cell signals. A bunch of civilians are sucked into the lower levels of the train system, while the ones left above ground trying to escape the curtain start demanding for Gojo Satoru to show up. 3. Several teams of sorcerers, composed of pretty much every Tokyo sorcerer we've seen so far, and some we haven't, are on standby outside the curtain, to pick off any stragglers Gojo leaves behind. The higher-ups decide to send him in alone, assuming he's strong enough to deal with whatever's going on by himself. 4. He arrives. Now let's get into some analysis. I just wanted to go over the specifics of how the fight works, since it can be a little hard to grasp and understand while everything's going down. Basically, Miwa uses a technique called New Shadow Style Simple Domain, which we were introduced to back in episode 15 in season 1 during the Goodwill event. She uses it in conjunction with the Bato sword drawing technique as a way to perform an automatic attack as soon as someone steps into the range of her domain. However, the technique was originally developed to protect weaker sorcerers from domain expansions, by neutralizing curse techniques within its range to keep those sorcerers from being killed by the guaranteed hit of a domain expansion. So, effectively, it trades off any kind of offensive potential in order to gain the ability to remove the opponent's offensive potential as well. By combining it with another technique, Miwa and whoever taught her managed to find a way to restore some offensive potential to it. Meanwhile, Muda, who couldn't perform the technique himself, was able to imbue it into these tubes he could utilize via Mekamaru, or apparently just by stabbing the target with them directly. Now, the reason the tubes were able to hurt Mahito is due to Simple Domain's effect of neutralizing cursed techniques, which removed Mahito's idle transfiguration, which he uses to reinforce his soul and keep normal attacks from damaging him. So, with the neutralization of his technique, Mahito becomes vulnerable to normal damage. When I first read through these chapters in the manga, it wasn't clear to me exactly how Muto was able to hurt Mahito or what the tubes were meant to be exactly. I was under the impression that Mahito's whole deal with only being able to be hurt if you hit his soul directly was some kind of passive effect that was a byproduct of his curse technique being related to the soul, not necessarily that he was actually just using his curse technique to keep his soul from changing when he got hurt, so any kind of normal attack to his body would just be superficial. So yeah, Mahito uses his curse technique to maintain the shape of his soul and keep physical attacks from hurting him, which is why only things that directly attack his soul and destroy parts of it, or, in this case, attacks that have some sort of neutralization function that disable his technique while hurting him, can hurt him. Next, I want to discuss some significant storytelling aspects of this fight. First, I want to point out how this fight kind of preps the audience for upcoming fights and offers insight into how combat works in the world of Jujutsu Kaisen. So far in the series, we've mostly been shown fights between inexperienced combatants as a way to introduce new concepts and build a basic idea of a power structure. In the upcoming arc, and the arcs that follow it, we get to see more and more fights between more experienced combatants. This fight serves to lay the groundwork to prep the viewer on what to expect from fights between more experienced Jujutsu users, as it introduces some ideas that the viewer will probably have expectations regarding, and then subverts them. For example, we see Muda with a giant mech and how his attacks tend to be giant energy beams, and the conventional thoughts on that would probably be that he'd be really strong and hard to beat, especially considering he's using them against a normal human-sized enemy in Mahito, not even another mech, which is usually the way the odds are even when something like a giant mech is in play. Of course, the whole idea of a combatant's size determining their strength is kinda done away with in fiction, especially shonen anime, which loves to have normal human-sized combatants throwing giant opponents around to show how impossibly strong they are. Even so, the energy beams are worth noting as well, since shonen anime has a perennial classic in the form of the Kamehameha wave from Dragon Ball. In fact, Dragon Ball Z in general tends to treat more energy as a de facto way to show that someone is stronger. Despite that, Muda is the one outclassed in this fight simply because Mahito outplays him. True enough, Muda did have a plan. But Mahito was quicker on his feet, which is a character trait he's shown to have repeatedly, rapidly adapting to every situation he finds himself in, and then overcoming his opponents with his newly awakened strength, which is really fitting for a curse born from the fear humans have of other humans, since humanity's greatest strength, and what led us to become the dominant species on the planet, is our ability to adapt to so many situations and environments. Back on the topic of Muta's plan though, we actually get a subtle callback to what Geto said to the assassin after Riko's bounty. Back on the topic of Muta's plan though, we actually get a subtle callback to what Geto said to the assassin after Riko's bounty back in episode 26. He told the guy he beat the snot out of that those with a single path to victory are easy to manipulate because they jump at the first chance they get to pursue it. Muta, in this fight, had a single path to victory, using his simple domain tubes to defeat Mahito. While it's unclear whether Mahito figured out what the tubes were when he hatched his plan, or if he just pieced together that if he acted like he was dead he could get the jump on Muta, he exploited the fact that Muta had only one path to victory to turn the tables on him, manipulating him into dropping his guard, and used that to defeat him. To loop all this back into my main point here, this fight sets the table for the upcoming fights that start to get more complex and require the combatants to get smart and outthink or outplan their opponents because more experienced combatants are in play. Up to this point, we've mostly been shown fights that are more or less all-out slugfests, or otherwise are so one-sided that the winning party just nukes the opposing side. While these kinds of fights don't disappear completely past this point, we are going to start seeing even more interesting fights with a lot of speed chess being played by everyone involved to outmaneuver each other, which really helps build the world of Jujutsu and shows that outside of the heavy hitters like Gojo or Sukuna, most Jujutsu fights are more about knowledge of the art and techniques and planning, rather than just brute force and overpowering opponents. Lastly, let's touch on the in-between pages from these chapters in the volume release of the manga. After chapter 80, we just get a little page offering a more detailed view of what I'm going to call Fish Hito. After chapter 81, we get another view of all the Kyoto students, with one in particular being pointed out as a first-year student. After chapter 82, we get a page where Akutami explains some Jujutsu terms. It says that an innate curse technique is basically the unique technique people are born with, that is close to impossible to copy. It says that whenever the term cursed technique is used, they're usually referring to this kind of technique. Then we get an explanation about barrier techniques. Basically, anyone with enough cursed energy to produce them can learn these techniques, though skill levels may vary from person to person. Basically, a sorcerer crafts the barrier with empowered words and then uses cursed energy to project it. Though they're often associated with curtains, domain expansions also use them. It also points out that curtains typically only work against civilians, which is why the one at the Goodwill event that could block Gojo was unique. Then we're given a one-sentence explanation on new shadow style, quote, and so on, unquote, that just says these techniques are like barriers and are constructed within the sorcerer and then projected. Anyway, that's all I really have for this week. Too bad we didn't get to see more of Mekamaru, and he didn't get to enjoy his newly healed body either. Or meet up with everyone, and let Miwa know he loved her. Rip to a not-so-real one, because he's a traitor. Maybe I'll do some character analysis on him in the coming episodes. Next week we'll have more Jujutsu Stroll. I wasn't expecting it this week, so I didn't have time to prepare it, but I will cram a bunch extra into next week's video. That's my episode recap and story analysis for the 7th episode of the 2nd season of Jujutsu Kaisen. Make sure to subscribe and turn on bell notifications if you want to be here as soon as possible each week as I put out new videos for each episode as it airs, and feel free to drop a comment with suggestions as to other videos you might like to see, such as character analysis videos or explanations. Thanks for watching.